Good morning. Welcome to Joy Comes in the Morning. And today is the day after our Easter weekend and celebrations. So hope you guys enjoyed Easter wherever you might have been. Maybe you're on vacation. Maybe you're visiting. Maybe you visited Grace yesterday because you happen to be in our area. Or maybe you're just part of our Grace family. And I'm sure you enjoyed the service that we had. It was beautiful, a time of communion, a time to really reflect and celebrate and rejoice in all that God did for us. So, all right, today we're just going to continue on in the story of what Jesus did during the Holy Week. And, obviously it culminated in what we celebrated yesterday and the resurrection of Jesus. But we're back at, I wanted just to kind of cover some of the some of the things that Jesus did during that week. Every single day, as we know, the first day was the triumphal entry, riding on a colt, and they were spreading palm branches, rejoicing, saying Hosanna, praising God, certainly causing a stir in the city, certainly causing the religious leaders to be very concerned, more than they already were, because they thought, oh no, we've totally lost the narrative, we've totally lost the plot here. What we feared has come upon us, and the Romans are going to come and crash down on us. So they were freaked out by Jesus coming in. But here's what happened is every single day, Jesus, during this week, every single day, he came into the temple and he taught. So he came in, and there's accounts that we glean from on his journey into the city, coming back out of the city. He didn't stay in the city at night, which you can imagine, as I mentioned last week, the city was filled with people. And probably everyone that had rooms that they could rent out, or family that came in for the Passover week, they were probably completely full. So Jesus was going out and he was staying outside of the city. And every single day he walked into the city with his disciples, and he went to the temple area and he taught there. So this is the whole process of what went on. That's why we have so much recorded about the things that Jesus taught that week. I guess I would just say, as I go through some of these things, I'm not teaching on these things, but pay attention to the fact, like, wow, I didn't actually realize it. And I'm saying maybe you did, but I didn't. The first time I really thought of this and I looked at it, and I was really specifically looking into what did Jesus do that week? Because I would say maybe, as a little girl celebrating this Holy Week, well, here I go. I go on these little side journeys, but I actually didn't realize like all that happened between Palm Sunday and then our church that I grew up in was Presbyterian. We always had a special service on Thursday night. They called it Maundy Thursday. And then we, of course, celebrated Easter. But I didn't, realize it was like, what all happened, that week. But it's clearly to be seen right in the pages of the scripture that Jesus did a lot of things during this week. It's all jam-packed. So what did transpire this week? Jesus and his disciples came into the city every day and spent the night outside the city. But during his time in the city, where he'd go to the temple and he would teach or do things, these are some of the things that happened that week. The story of him cleansing the temple, where he overturned the tables of the money changers, that happened that week. He's questioned by the religious leaders that week, and these are some of the questions that they asked of him. They said, what is the authority with which you are doing these things? That's a question they asked of him that week. They asked him, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? They asked, whose wife is the woman who married a man and his 7 brothers? And you recall that all of these questions were for the purpose of trying to find fault in Jesus. When they came and asked him about, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? He asked them to show a coin, and he said, whose inscription is on that coin? And they said, Caesar's. So who is Caesar? He was the head of the Roman Empire. And so they were paying taxes. This is part of the oppression that they, as a nation, wanted to get out of. And actually the leaders were afraid that their uprising against the nation that they thought Jesus was going to lead was going to bring a heavy-fisted hand down on their nation by the Romans. So they were actually willing to stay in that state of oppression, even though Jesus was not doing any of what any of them were thinking. And Jesus said, "Whose inscription is that?" And they said, "Caesar's." And his answer was, "Well, pay what is due to Caesar, but you pay what to God, what is owed to God." So basically, he always confounded them with his answers. Like, he answered in a way they didn't expect. They couldn't find any reason to trap him. And as you know, once they got to the point of arresting him, they had to bring false witnesses together to try to find a reason that they could put him to death or accuse him to put him to death. So they couldn't find anything. In all of their efforts, they were unable to find a reason that they could accuse Jesus. They couldn't find fault with him. His answers were always like, with such wisdom, they'd always leave. They would leave and somebody else would try. So that's how it went during that week. So you can imagine. Now remember, Jesus was very purposeful about what he was doing this week. So I feel like the intensity had to be really strong. He was going in every single week facing these religious leaders that wanted to destroy him. And yet Jesus knew what he was about to do, and he knew that there would be, that these religious leaders and what they did would facilitate the death that he was to die in the way that was prescribed on a Roman cross. All of this is amazing when you think about it, that which was prophesied and that which Jesus said was going to happen exactly happened. And all the people that were involved in facilitating this pathway didn't understand that they were actually they were participating in a plan that would ultimately bring a place of forgiveness and salvation for them. In the end, no matter who they were, whether they were the Romans that were oppressing the nation, whether they were the religious leaders that thought they were following God, but were filled with manipulation and filled with unholy ways of trying to manipulate things. And I would say, look at our politicians today. That's the same spirit. Like, Jesus had warned his disciples of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Well, I feel like you can see the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod in our leaders, many of our leaders today, because they do things that are so twisted and manipulative in order to bring about or to preserve their own power or to bring about an outcome that they want to bring out, even at the cost of the lives of innocent people around them. I guess I'm just much more amazed at people that will yield themselves to the enemy and be used in very corrupt ways. Well, Jesus was facing this every single day, and yet he was purposeful. His face was turned toward Jerusalem. He knew what had to be done that week, and he loved everyone that we see in this whole story. He loved the Pharisees. He loved the Romans. He loved his disciples. He loved the people that were celebrating him as he came into the city, knowing full well that by the end of the week, they would turn on him. He knew all that, and yet he stayed the course, and he did this day in and day out throughout this Holy Week. All right, so during this week, these are some of the things that he taught his followers when he would go into the city. He taught his followers about the widow and the two mites. So they were in a position where they saw people bringing money. The Bible calls it bring it to the treasury. People would drop in coins into this place, and or large amounts of money they would drop in their offerings. And so what Jesus highlighted to his disciples was this woman, this widow woman, who had just put in 2 mites, like a very small, it had very little value what she put into it. But he told his disciples, she has put in more than everyone else. And it's like, okay, that doesn't make sense because she put in 2 mites and some of these other people have been putting large amounts of money in. But he was basically pointing out that even though she didn't have much, she gave what she had. And he was showing how God values our generosity even if what we have to give isn't much. He said she gave more than them all. And of course, in the natural, that wasn't true. She only gave a tiny little bit, and other people gave a lot. But Jesus was saying she gave more because she gave out of her lack. And that's just almost, to mention to you, if you're in lack today, the worst thing you can do is to stop giving. And you can give in a lot of different ways. You can serve, you can do things for other people, you can offer things that cost no money. But if you have something to give, and I believe God does give seed to the sower, start giving. And even if you think, this doesn't make any difference, like, we just got through a roof campaign at our church, and praise God, like we needed to raise $450,000 for this roof. And we already had some money set aside for it. I believe that the amount that we needed to raise from offerings was either $200,000 or $250,000. So somewhere in the range of about half of what we needed as a total was what we had to raise. And we raised it. In fact, they finished the job just a couple weeks ago, and we were able to pay it off. Well, I could look back and say, I don't know how that happens, but it happened. And some of you weren't able to give much towards it. But this would be the story. Like if you gave something and you gave out of your lack, even if you gave $1, and you could say, what difference does $1 make? It makes no difference. It does make a difference. And even between you and the Lord, giving your $1 could have been him looking at you saying, you gave more than the person that gave $1,000. Because it was out of a heart that says, I want to be generous, and I'm going to give you, Lord, what I have. So anyway, Jesus told this story of the widow with the 2 mites. I told you I wasn't going to teach on these things, so I didn't really mean to go off into that, but okay. He taught the details in answer to their question about the destruction of Jerusalem. And the only thing I'll really say about that is you find a lot of that in Matthew chapter 24, I believe 25. And this is during that week before he was arrested that he is telling his disciples. Again, they had this idea of in the natural what they were looking at. But what Jesus talked to them about, a lot of people today use a lot of what Jesus said, and they use it to interpret the end of the world. And Jesus was basically talking about the end of the temple worship that was going to happen in 70 AD. And I'm not saying that there was nothing Jesus said in that wasn't prophetic about the future. I'm just saying that a lot of what Jesus was prophesying about was to the nation of Israel and talking to them about the fact that in 70 AD that the Romans were going to destroy the temple. Because, he talked about, see this temple? And it was beautiful. Like this temple was absolutely beautiful. And Jesus said that there would come a day where every stone would be destroyed and pulled off of this structure. So anyway, he did talk to his disciples about that, and that again I'm not intending on teaching on that. He talked about his second coming. He talked about that, and of course, he talked about it in the light of like no one's going to know this, that only his Father in heaven knows this, at the day and the hour when Jesus will come back. But that's a huge doctrine in the church, that we believe that as Jesus ascended to heaven, that he is going to come back in like manner, and that every eye is going to see this, which to us doesn't make sense, right? Because you think like Jesus actually ascended to heaven from a geographical location. And for every eye to see him, how is that possible? Because there's people, I don't know what would be on the opposite side of the world from that geographic location, but there is an opposite side of the world. That could be an ocean, but there are continents on the other side of the world that would not see it. For instance, our continent, like we would be not able to see someone that is descending from heaven to put his feet on the earth again. But the Bible says that every eye is going to see. So however that happens, we will see it. He talked about the grain of wheat needing to die in order for there to be a harvest. And he was talking about that in light of his death, and that out of his death and resurrection would be this great harvest. That is the joy that's set before him, that he went in obedience to die on the cross. He talked about faith, and this was one of the days he's walking into Jerusalem, and it's the story of him seeing the fig tree that's off a ways, and he went to the fig tree and discovered that it had no fruit on it, even though it was before the time of the fruit, but he cursed the fig tree. And this was a lesson that he was able to teach his disciples about faith, the operation of faith, that you can speak to something, and if you don't doubt in your heart, that you will have what you say. And so they immediately saw that from the roots of this tree, that this tree shriveled up, because he said that no one would eat fruit of it ever again. This is what Jesus said to the fig tree. But this was all used as a lesson to teach his disciples the operation of faith as a powerful spiritual force, and how we use it, because it is the substance of things hoped for. And in Mark 11:23 and 24, it gives us the clear understanding of how to operate in faith. Jesus did it consistently throughout his life and ministry, and then he very clearly defines how faith operates by using this example of him cursing the fig tree. He talked to them about the greatest commandment, and that we find this in Mark 12:30 and 31. It says, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second like it is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Then he said, "There's no other commandment greater than these." So he talked to his disciples about the great commandment. Some of the parables that he taught this week, he talked about the 10 virgins, and about how 5 of them were foolish and 5 of them were wise. And it was because the foolish ones had not prepared and brought oil to keep their lamps burning. So again, I'm not teaching on the parable, but I'm just highlighting all that Jesus did this week. There's so much substance and so much that we use foundationally in our teachings in the church today that Jesus taught during that week. He talked about the landowner and the vineyard owner, which the stories are very similar, that the land, the vineyards were leased out to someone else, and then the landowner would send representatives to gather what they owed him, and they would beat them up, send them away. They would even kill them. The landowner, the vineyard owner, would send his son. This is all a story about Jesus, right? And it's a story about the fact that we are stewards of what God has given us. The things that we have do not belong to us, and we are to give God what is due him, which basically is everything. Like, we basically say, God, thank you for everything you've given me. I'm a steward of it. Whatever you ask of me, I will give to you. Whatever, and it's really a story of that. It's being good stewards, and the time that the landowner, the vineyard owner is away, that we will be good managers of what God has given us, and we will always return to him what belongs to him. He told the parable of the talents, and again, that's a story that talks about someone giving something to us that we're to be utilizing for kingdom purposes, and all he asks is that we would use the talents that he's given us, that we would invest them, that we would use our talents. Like, this is all that he asks of us. Again, it's speaking of us staying busy and occupying until he comes, that we are his, but what he's given us actually belongs to him, and he's going to come back and receive it again, and all that he wants is that we would have invested it and that we would seek growth for kingdom purpose. He talked about the 2 sons, and this is the one where he talked about the one who said he would go but didn't go, and the one who said he wouldn't go but then he went. So he's basically doing that story to highlight the need for us not just to be people that say we're going to do something, because what really counts is our follow through and our actions. So the importance of being people of our word, but the doing is the one that says they're the ones who do what I said, not just the ones that use their mouth and say, yes, I'll do that. Say, yes, Lord, but we never follow through and do the things that he's given us to do or respond in ways according to his word. So these are all parables that he told this week before he was about to be arrested. So when Thursday came, and Jesus gave his disciples instructions to go find a place they could celebrate the Passover meal together. And as I mentioned last week, the Jewish day was from sundown to sundown. So the Passover meal would have been eaten at sundown, or actually the beginning of the next day. So if you've ever wondered, and so I'll just share this little interesting tidbit. If you've ever been stumped on the fact that the Bible tells us that Jesus would be in the belly of the whale, or he would, after he died, it would be on the third day that he was raised from the dead. It doesn't say like 3 days if you're going to count. Like if I were going to count 3 days from Friday afternoon when Jesus died, I would count to Monday. But we know that he was raised from the dead on the first day of the week, which would have been Sunday. And so how is that 3 days? Well, it is 3 days because he died on Friday at about 3 p.m. And that was on Friday still. So the next day did not start till sundown, which was only about 3 days after he died. And then that would be the Sabbath day, which was Saturday, which would end at sundown. And Sunday, or the next day, would end at sundown on what we would consider Saturday. Because our time goes from midnight to midnight. So we think of morning starting after midnight, and all of those early morning hours being the wee hours of the morning, when actually, according to the way they did it, their day started at sundown. So by the time they got to midnight, they were 6 hours into their day. So Jesus died about 3 o'clock on a Friday. And so sundown would have instituted the second day. And then the sundown that came on Saturday would be the beginning of the third day. And we know that Jesus was raised from the dead even before daybreak on Sunday. So that's 3 days. He died on a Friday. That's 1 day. He was dead and buried on Saturday, and sometime in the early hours of Sunday, he was raised from the dead. So that's the third day. So maybe that's not interesting to you, but I used to be one of those things that I would be challenged by, like, I can't really like make sense of that. Like, it's not 3 days, because the way I would have calculated, I would say it was 2 days. Friday to Saturday being 1, Saturday to Sunday being 2. But no, he had died and was raised on the third day. So maybe that's interesting information. Maybe that'll help you. Maybe that'll answer a question that you had about the 3 days. All right. When Jesus sat down to eat the Passover meal on this Thursday, and actually it was a Friday morning, so not to confuse it, by the time they ate, it was already the next day. At sundown began the day for the next day, the day he was arrested. When he sat down to eat the Passover meal with his disciples, it was about 21 hours before he was going to die on the cross. And it was only about 15 hours from the time that they would hang him on the cross, because he was up on the cross for about 6 hours, from 9 in the morning until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Torturous time. But the reason I'm bringing this out is to maybe just draw your attention to Jesus knowing what was going to happen, that when he sat down to eat his Passover meal, in which so much happened, that he knew what was coming, and it was just a few hours away. Jesus never again would sleep. Like, there was no more sleep for him. So from the time that he sat down to eat the Passover meal, he'd already been up for I don't know how many hours from the night before. And then he sat down and had the Passover meal. There's so much that happened there. They go out to the Garden of the Gethsemane, which I'll talk about next week. And then he's laboring in prayer, and then the arrest, and then the fake trials, the fake indictments, the fake trials, the unjust judgments that came against him, going before Pilate, and then dying this horrible death on the cross. All of that was going to happen within 21 hours, and 15 hours till they hung him on the cross, and just a few hours before he was arrested and then beaten and cruelly treated. And I only bring that up just to make you stop and think for a minute, like it has impacted me when I stop and think about it. Jesus continued to be purposeful in what he knew he needed to impart to his disciples before he left. And I find that to be such a gift of love and such a sacrifice on his part. It's just absolutely moving. So I'm going to end there. And so next week, which will be a full week after Easter, we're still going to be talking about what happened, beginning with that Passover meal that he had with his disciples and all that transpired leading up to his death and his burial and his resurrection. But I don't know about you, but I'm all about Jesus. And so we could talk about this. We could actually